This programming conversation is from my exclusive coach community called the Wormhole, where we have weekly live calls and group calls to discuss questions around content and developing your understanding of programming, coaching, movement, strength development, whatever it is you need to get better and more confident as a coach. It's very cheap. It's 75 Aussie dollars per month. The link is down below. We have live group calls, we have weekly content and exclusive offers within the community. And I would love for you to check it out. First link down below. That's all I really care about. With all of this information is that it's as easy as possible to apply and know that you're on the right path, to remove the confusion and all of that sort of stuff. So this slide is just kind of like, we need to get everyone on the same page to understand like the outcomes of training, but also like how we can structure things a little bit more productively. And this is the old school traditional like periodization in like the periodization flavors of the industry from like the fucking 70s and 80s and whenever that was. This was the understanding originally, and some of this is still in the industry now, which is frustrating because our understanding has updated. But it also confuses programming, whether it be a current block or a progressive block and all of this. And it's something that we're going to continually come back to. But this is the traditional view of programming, and that is that in the same way of the BPS model, that these three areas are somehow, they're connected, but they're also like not connected, and there's these areas that they need a special consideration. So like strength training, yeah, hypertrophy and the skill of movement matters a little bit, but it has its own bubble and it's like its own thing. Same with hypertrophy and skill. These ideas are kind of connected, but not really. And that's how you get to like block periodization, which is where you'll do like a hypertrophy block, or like a skill development block, a hypertrophy block, and then a strength block, and then a power block, and all of that sort of stuff, where in reality, that's not how the system actually progresses and evolves and adapts. These things are actually more connected than people were led to believe. But now that the updated understanding is there, it shouldn't be thought in that way at all. And it should be more something like this. Push all of those bubbles together. And yes, there are small considerations for each of them at independent levels. However, when we push these ideas together, we can see how they all interrelate to each other, and the programming structure ultimately can be built and formed in a way that is just way more practical and way more progressive and effective. And ultimately, this is the idea that I want you to try to get around, and I'm going to show you how this works in practical use case with some programming ideas. But these three independent training outcomes are inherently connected. You cannot remove them from each other. There are small considerations around each one. Absolutely. There always is going to be contextual ideas and nuance that matters when discussing purely strength training. However, when we're actually helping clients and getting people stronger over time, these things are so much more connected than people believe. And this is how I actually view them. And this is how I actually think about when I'm writing a program. This is one of the first things that I think about is, what are the exposures of the program? What does this client actually need to improve their strength? So in the middle here, we have what I would call a strength exposure. And typically this is going to be your primary lift. I like to have it at the start of the week, but that is contextual in and of itself. But ultimately, when we think of strength training, it doesn't have to be the entire block. It can literally just be the lift once, one exposure of the week. If you're going to squat twice a week, one of them is a strength exposure and one of them is a skill or a volume exposure. And within those exposures of the week, they have separate sets, reps, and variables and all of that sort of stuff that bleeds more of that outcome. However, they can be so inherently connected, and they are so inherently connected, that we may as well think about them as two separate entities that are improving the other day, the other exposure throughout the week. So in the middle, we have our strength exposure. And this is just the typical recommendations that everyone thinks about with strength training. It's probably going to be lower rep ranges. I like the cutoff at 6. I think if you're doing 7s, 8s, and 10s, yes, it can still be deemed strength training. But when we think of strength as an outcome, we know it's fucking heavy and hard, and it's probably only going to be 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and maybe 6s depending on the lift. So rep range is probably going to be lower. The sets is just enough to accumulate some acute fatigue. You actually want to create some fatigue within the sets for good strength training. And the reason is because that fatigue is making the expression of movement and the expression of force and high threshold motor units a requirement to actually get the lift done. So you want there to be a little bit of fatigue accumulated, and you can manage that through RPE programming and progressions and ramps or top sets and back offs and all of this sort of stuff. But ultimately, the sets themselves, how many sets we need, is contextual to how much fatigue we're trying to create within the acute setting of that exposure. The rep speed should slow down. That is one of the easiest proxies that you can use with clients and educate clients around, is that if your first rep and your last rep are the same speed, we're probably not creating any acute fatigue within that set. And it's probably not hard enough, and the RPE, no matter what they say, is probably not accurate. So the rep speed should be slowing. And as you accumulate more acute fatigue within the exposure, the rep speed should be slowing more as the sets progress within the set, and also from set 1 to set 2, set 3, and whatever else. A little bit of technique breakdown is actually okay here, and if you've gone and watched if you've gone and watched the stimulus video that also drops this week, that should make a little bit more sense to you as well. But when you're training strength, it doesn't have to be perfect. I like good enough is near enough. Like, that's fine. Like 80% of your technique, big rocks, should be hit. If we're breaking technique all the time, all right, it's too hard. But if there's a little bit of breakdown in a true strength it's fine. As you progress and as your clients progress and their efficiency improves, the breakdown will be less, because they've just become more efficient and they can execute more regularly under high loads and under high amounts of fatigue, which is great. And that's the gold standard, and where we're heading is that there shouldn't really be any change in the expression of movement for good strength training over time. But if you're helping clients, a little bit of breakdown is actually fine. It just means that we're near the brink of failure, which is fantastic, because that is ultimately the stimulus for skill. It is the stimulus for all of the outcomes, strength, hypertrophy, and everything. So a little bit of technique breakdown is fine in a good strength exposure. And if you've got the sets and the reps and the loads and the RPEs set up, you can really challenge that expression of the movement, which is ultimately what we're looking to do with good strength training. RPEs are going to be moderate to high. So at least 7s, probably some 8s, majority 8s, 8.5, 7.5, 8.5s. And a little bit of 9s. We probably don't want to go above 9. There's really no point. There's times where you might use a 10, peaking phases, probably not peaking phases, but definitely testing phases. But for the most part, most of our RPEs are going to be between 7s and 9s. And the exercise selection is ultimately going to be constrained to the goals of what we're trying to do. So this is just good strength training. However, it's not the whole week that needs to look like that. It's just the main exposures throughout the weeks of the lifts that you're trying to progress for your client. So your squat exposure on day 1 might be the strength, and on day 3 you come back and do a technical exposure, which we'll break down next. Or day 3 might look like a volume exposure of a squat, where we can push some different qualities, some different rep ranges, and all of that sort of stuff. So just your typical strength training there. Let's go to the left now, which would become like your technical exposure or your skill exposure within the week. So again, it's probably going to be lower rep ranges, because to really challenge the skill expression, doing 10 really good reps and then rep 11 and rep 12 under a crazy amount of fatigue, it starts to break down, is not as effective for learning new skills as doing 5 really challenging good reps, having a break, getting some feedback, thinking about it, maybe watching the video back, and then going back and doing another set of 5, and then going back and doing another set of 5. So you want more exposures rather than just accumulating all your work under 1 or 2 hard sets. So lower rep ranges, sets, it's probably going to be higher amount of sets because that means we get more feedback. It's more exposure. It's more break to think about it. What did I do well? Let's go back and retake that again. So there's just more opportunity for learning if we stop, have a second, come back, stop, have a second, and come back. And that's the whole idea of frequency, that if you want to get good at a skill, you should increase the frequency. Well, you can do that within a session itself by reducing the reps a little bit and just increasing the sets a little bit, because those volumes and intensity are probably going to be sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for here? Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. But as one goes up, the other one probably should come down, volume and intensity. RPE is going to be very contextual. And I like to think of skill as there's 2 phases of skill. There's the learning phase of a skill, which probably needs to be easier because you're trying to really feel it. It's very sensory driven and trying to feel things and coordinate things and time things and all of that sort of stuff. And then there's skill exposing, which is more of your output driven skill training, which is higher RPEs. And this is the part of the program where the client has really started to develop their understanding and their awareness and their context and their feelings and sensations. They've done the learning and now it's time to challenge it. So skill itself and the exposure of skill within the program might actually have 2 separate qualities that progress over time, but we're probably going to be learning stuff first, which is going to have lower RPEs. And when we start to expose them, they're confident, they're ready to go. That becomes more about exposing the skill and higher RPEs. So it's a little bit contextual, but again, it's a simple framework that you can use depending on where your client is with their training progression and their understanding. Exercise selections are still going to be constrained to their goals. So again, your day 1 might look like a high bar squat within these parameters. Your day 3 might still look like a high bar squat, but maybe it's a tempo, maybe it's a pause, whatever it needs to be to slow it down so they can feel more things and execute at a higher level with their technique. And for this, we're actually not looking for breakdown. If we're doing a true technical day, we don't want breakdown. We want them on the brink of when their technique is challenged, but the strength work is there to allow for a little bit of breakdown because output is so high. A true technical exposure, we're looking to really nail the technique and get the right things and feel the right things and be confident, which means some technique breakdown is probably not what we're looking for with a good technical exposure within the program. And ultimately, we're looking to feel these technical things across the whole week. And this is a huge thing. Once you understand that movement expression is global, something like trying to get a client to balance better in a squat and learning midfoot and learning bracing and pelvic position and rib cage. Once we go back to this slide and view that the whole thing is actually way more connected than anyone was ever leading us to believe, you can actually look for things within your accessory work that are not squatting. I'm just using squatting as the context, but are not squatting to apply those feelings. So the midfoot thing, all of a sudden, maybe something like a belt squat or a split squat or an RDL or whatever it is in the program as an accessory, you can bleed some of those feelings and some of that awareness and sensory stuff into those exercises as well. And the whole thing, the whole program really just starts to feed itself and drive itself in the direction that we're looking for. And this is part of that idea of these things are way more connected than people want you to believe, and probably try to confuse you because they teach you that they're independent and they have their own contextual or fucking whatever else. Like they're much the same. There's small tweaks and small contextual ideas. So again, strength exposure is your typical stuff. It's your day 1. Your technical exposure, if the client needs some more technique work, you might build a technical exposure within the training week. Then we have our volume exposure that's probably going to be somewhere. Your volume exposure is more than likely, depending on the goal of the client and what their sort of rate limiter is for their strength training, it's probably going to be secondary to one of these. So you might have your A1 your normal squatting strength exposure, and then maybe your B series is more of a volume exposure. As opposed to these two things are probably going to be separated within the training week. Volume exposure could also follow up from a technical exposure. Technical exposure is your A series, your B series becomes your volume exposure. If you wanted 3 frequency of squat patterns, you might have a strength day, a technical day, and a volume day. And then that's how these exposures are just pieces that you can piece together within the program. And that's why I like this as a framework. Once you understand this stuff, it becomes very easy to just see, oh, that makes sense. Well, if I've got that there, well, I need something over here that looks a little bit different. I'm going to build a skill exposure because this client's new. I'm going to build a volume exposure because their technique's actually really good. Let's get that output. Let's get that hypertrophy stimulus, and let's build the muscle and really push that style of training a little harder. So your volume exposure, your rep range is going to be moderate to high. It's anywhere from like 6 to 15 in most practical cases. Obviously, the rep range itself is probably tied to the exercise. You're not going to be doing sets of 15 for RDLs and shit. Some people do, but most people don't want to do that. If you're going to do sets of 15 for something like that, it's probably going to be like a hip thrust and drop sets and shortened bias training. And there's a whole lot of stuff that we need to discuss around that. But ultimately, the rep ranges for hypertrophy are contextually tied to the exercises, but the window is pretty open. We can hit 6s, we can ultimately hit 1s, but 6s, 8s, 10s, 12s, and 15s just make the most sense. The sets, we need enough for good quality tension on the muscle. Doing more sets and more volume is not in science. Absolutely, it makes sense that volume drives tension and tension is the stimulus for hypertrophy. It makes sense. The practical use case for that information, though, doesn't make sense, because just giving a client that is not training well, their technique sucks, they can't load the muscle correctly, their proximity to failure and their RPEs are inaccurate, they don't know how hard they're training, just giving them more volume is not the answer. We want enough sets of good quality work. More does not equal better. More often than not, it's probably 2 really good sets for most people is probably where I would start. And to be honest, is probably where most people end in terms of volume for a really good volume exposure. Proximity to failure is the stimulus for volume. It's the stimulus for everything. How hard it is the stimulus. So we've got to make sure that the training itself is hard in the context of hypertrophy, which is that the target muscle is actually getting fatigued and tensioned. And that changes our exercise selections and our cueing and our tempos and all of that sort of stuff. But ultimately, just doing more sets doesn't matter if the training quality itself is trash. Training intensity is way more important in practical use case for clients than volume ever will be. And it's unfortunate that there's obviously good researchers and stuff out there, but it's unfortunate that this volume idea got so much wind and everyone just got on the volume bandwagon when in reality, in practical use case as a coach, your client probably just isn't training hard enough first. And that's more than likely their main problem for getting long-term gains. They've got to get the training intensity, tick that box first before you even have the discussion on volume and increasing volume. Because of all of this, RPEs need to be high, real high. 8.5s is almost a minimum if you really want to do good hypertrophy work. Obviously, again, the exercise itself is contextual to the RPE and the rep ranges and all of that sort of stuff. But if you really want to push hypertrophy, you have to be training pretty darn close to proximity to failure. So 8.5s, 9s, 9.5s, and 10s just make the most sense. Exercise selection for this is very open. For hypertrophy, the exercise itself doesn't matter. What actually matters is the stimulus, how hard the muscle's actually working and the tension response of the muscle. There's a couple of things that are really important for hypertrophy though. Chasing range of motion, lengthened bias seems to be better in the research, but it also just seems to just make more sense for most people. Shortened bias training requires more volume because the concentric position of the muscle creates more active tension, or the shortened position of the muscle creates more active tension, which just requires more contractions and more active tension to be the driver of the stimulus. Lengthened bias and larger ranges of motion means we cover more of the tension curve, which means we actually pick up more tension across a single rep, which means we actually need a little less volume. So lengthened bias makes sense practically and from the science and where the science is working. So when in doubt, choose an exercise that challenges a larger range of motion, and if you can sort of piece that with the most difficult part of the lift is more closer to a lengthened position, it makes a lot more sense as well. We're looking for control repeated movement, because if it's not controlled, if the technique can't be repeated, we're probably not stimulating the muscle itself. We're probably stimulating a coordinated effort of a bunch of muscles that can share load and change technique to achieve the task. And this is ultimately where then you end up in machines make the most sense. You want to minimize the technical requirement. You want the exercise to be dumb. You don't want the client to be thinking for volume movements. You just want them to be hammering output and just pushing hard training. So all of these ideas that stem from the research around programming make sense, but I think a lot of coaches struggle to piece them together. And ultimately,